How does a data center asset liquidation and demolition company get connected to decision makers? So your company provides asset liquidation and demolition, probably pretty similar to decommissioning in and around data centers, and you want to get connected to decision makers. What it first comes down to is recognizing that the idea of getting this magic connection that exempts you from having to do all of the other things that competitive companies in your industry are doing today is absurd. There is no shortcut. It's about the same shortcut as if I said to you, I've never been able to jog more than a mile or two, but next week I'm going to run a marathon because there's a magic connect marathon algorithm that's going to allow me to go from having the stamina of jogging for 15 or 20 minutes to being able to jog a marathon for 4 or 5 hours. And it's going to happen next week because there's this magic API, there's this magic service, there's this magic package that's going to accelerate all of that. If only. The reality is it's really important to understand your business model. It's critical to understand the kinds of companies that you've been successful with in the past. For most companies that do like asset liquidation and demolition in and around the data center industry, you probably have a pretty healthy list of past clients. You probably brag about these logos on your website. Maybe you have some case studies up on your website. And I'd encourage you to think about what your biggest success stories have in common. Because once you have an idea of what those biggest success stories have in common, you can document a simple one-page ideal client profile, where these companies are located, how big they are or how small they are, what's their headcount, square footage, how many locations, and you can figure out, are there certain industries where you've been more successful than others? In other words, are there places where you have expert competency, certifications, where you're really good with compliance and certain kinds of things like healthcare related data centers, financial services related data centers, or in those particular instances, do you get knocked out really, really early on because you don't meet the requirements of what they're looking for? That helps you to get a tremendous amount of clarity of what your ideal client is going to look like and goes into your simple one-page ideal client profile. From there, you should be able to build out a targeted account list of the couple dozen, couple hundred, couple thousand companies that fit that ICP, that fit that ideal client profile. From there, that can power a lot of different things that you're doing. But at the end of the day, we're not done when we know the companies. We need to know who within those companies are the decision makers. And as a starting point, we're going to go back and look at where you've been most successful in those case studies, in those logos that are up on your website. What are the job titles and job roles that you interacted with on a regular basis before, during, and post-purchase? From there, we should start to get a consensus on who the most important economic stakeholder is, who the second most important economic stakeholder is. Perhaps there's other kinds of stakeholders beyond the primary and secondary that get involved in the conversations, but generally aren't major factors. Once we know that, we can designate a primary and a secondary buyer persona, and we can go out and do the research on what makes these folks tick, what drives their decision making. What are their biggest goals? What are their biggest challenges? Where they hang out online and offline? And we need to get this insight in their own words, not what we think those words probably are, but what those words actually are. Because the difference between doing the actual research and getting the language and the messaging right versus relying on Bob, who's been selling to these companies for 27 years, to pull this out of thin air and tell you, based on Bob's experience, what they actually say. Okay, so Bob is a veteran for sure. He has a lot of value to your company, a lot of value to your clients. And I would tell you that Bob should probably be about 20%, 25% of your input. Actually, Bob as a placeholder for all of your internal input, among your CEO, among your head of customer success, your CMO, your board, whoever you're pulling this internal input from. Your internal input should be about 20 or 25%. The other 75, 80% of this customer insight research has to come from actual research. If you can do this in person, face-to-face, it's the best. Second best, fire up your Zoom account and your Calendly and book some 20 or 30-minute sessions to interview them. You can run surveys. At the absolute minimum, the better than nothing, but not ideal, is you can look at a stack of their LinkedIn profiles. You can figure out 10 or 20 representative people and go and look at their LinkedIn profiles and put the same people's first, last, and company name into a Google search and figure out how they describe themselves. On LinkedIn, that's fantastic because you'll know they'll have written a headline, they'll have written a summary about themselves, how they describe their jobs. Look at that consensus on that. Look at that'll help you give you consensus on their biggest goals. It'll help you get back into consensus on their biggest challenges, the groups, the skills identifiers, the certifications. And obviously, if you're coming across a couple of LinkedIn profiles and you can tell that they have like 37 connections and they don't have an active profile picture, and it looks like they haven't been on LinkedIn in years, you obviously disregard that and keep looking for people that have a more robust LinkedIn profile that you can use for research purposes. Why LinkedIn so much, by the way? Because when it comes to most things in and around the data center, over the last several years, it's now come into focus that LinkedIn is the predominant B2B professional networking platform that's relevant to internal champions about digital infrastructure, data centers, mission critical type of environments. Yeah, there will be outliers who say they feel in their career that they don't need to do this, but those outliers tend to be in the 9th or 10th inning or 11th or 12th inning of their careers. They're probably not real focused on professional development or growth or networking, because in a lot of ways, with 1 billion members now worldwide, LinkedIn has become the 724 365 conference that doesn't stop. So that can be a great source of insider research to helping you get inside the minds of decision makers and how you can add a lot of value. And then from there, you'll start to map into what the decision committee looks like. There's no such magic connection to a decision maker anymore in 90% of the instances. Even if you manage to get the attention of the CEO or CTO or the CIO or CFO or something like that, they're inevitably going to send you back to their team to go build consensus amount. So let's just dispel the myth that there is a magic decision maker. It's usually a decision committee. And that decision committee is ideally suited to being receptive to education that helps them do their job better when it comes to anything and everything having to do with asset liquidation and demolition. So your goal should be to be the most world-renowned, most preeminent, best, well-known leader of expertise around anything and everything having to do with data center, asset liquidation, and demolition. And you can do this through blogs, podcasts, webinars, research reports. But at the end of the day, those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision, your goal is to monopolize and dominate, so much to the point that there's virtually no room for anyone that competes with you to get a word in edgewise, because you've completely crushed it when it comes to educating and building trust with members of the decision committee. So how do you get members, plural, to be talking about you and spreading your expertise? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. Let's say, for example, you decide to invest in a monthly webinar program or a bi-weekly webinar program or whatever you think will work best to accomplishing the touchpoint goals. For starters, on the webinar registration form, as you've likely seen with DCSMI, we have a write-in field asking every person their biggest sales and marketing challenge. So your version would be, what's your biggest question about or your biggest struggle when it comes to data center asset liquidation and demolition? Get them to write that in their own words. Obviously, that goes into your CRM, so it's like gold for your sales team to understand what's top of mind for that particular person. And the consensus on 4, 5, 6 of those across the decision committee in a particular company is also gold for telling you what their priorities are. So that's thing number one. Thing number two that's incredibly impactful is when they register for your webinar, when they register to watch the recording, when they register to download your free ebook or your planning guide or your state of research report or whatever you're doing, they get a message back that delivers and confirms and says, who else should attend? Who else should watch this? Who else should be reading this? You know, when it comes to data center asset liquidation and demolition, it truly takes a village. In most companies, there's typically people involved from this team, this department, this job role, that department. So with that in mind, is there anyone else on your team who should also be attending this, watching this, reading this? If so, simply hit the forward button and let them know why this matters. You'd be shocked at how the simple email marketing automation that you've been able to do for 20 years, how effective it still works, because it is not the same as someone putting their neck out on the line and endorsing your company. All it's doing is saying, hey, Bob, hey, Sally, I found this great webinar. I think you'll find it valuable too. I found this great downloadable guide. I think our team could really use it. And you'll know this is working in two different ways. For starters, you'll know it's working because you look down at HubSpot or whatever you're using to keep track of this, and you're like, oh my gosh, there's like 6, 7, 8 people from the same company who've all converted on our landing page in the last 30 minutes or an hour. They're talking about us. And that's the goal, is to get them talking about you and your expertise. And you'll know it's really working because by the time you go out to meet with that prospect or client the first time, you'll discover that they used their methodology as free consulting. They used your methodology to set up the criteria that they used to evaluate all of the other options that were in front of them. So your content, your thought leadership, your education and trust building that you did through your downloadables, through your podcast, through your webinars, through your live streams, through all of this stuff in aggregate with controlling as many of those 28 touch points as possible, not only got you onto the short list, not only ensured that you stayed on the short list throughout the buyer's journey because you stayed with multiple stakeholders from the same company in an educational context throughout their buyer's journey. In some cases, in a lot of cases, it not neutralizes and knocks out many or most of the competitive options to the point where the short list can sometimes even collapse down into your company being the last person that's left on the short list before that initial meeting. And you imagine how awesome that initial sales meeting is when you go in and they're quoting you in their methodology and their priorities, and someone accidentally lets it slip that, yeah, this is the reason why they're not talking to anyone else at this point. Fish in a barrel. So if you're serious about your data center asset liquidation and demolition company being seen as the go-to experts in your space and getting connected to the right decision makers to put amazing deals up on your deals board, into your pipeline that close into amazing sources of new clients and revenue growth, this is the playbook going forward.